Is starting hard?
You know it is. I don't know what you do when you start, but I clean my desk. I make a lot of stupid appointments that I make sound important. Avoidance, delay, denial. I'm always scared that I'm not gonna know what to do. It's a terrifying moment. And then when I start, I'm always amazed. Oh, that wasn't so bad.
If you're a complete layman and not an architectural specialist, what's so hot about Frank Gehry? What's all the fuss about?
He's changed the look of a very, in a sense, conservative field.
He mixes the freewheelingness of art with something that is really concrete and unforgiving, which is the laws of physics. And you put up a post and lintel construction or a building, and man, that thing has got to stand. And I believe all of his buildings have been standing.
He's an architect who is also an artist. He takes so many risks, and that's what artists do. Artists take risks to do something new that no one has seen before.
I look at him as a hyphenate. I look at him as a writer-director, someone who sits down, conceives of something, thinks it up with just a blank piece of paper in front of him, and then has the ability to execute it into a visual image.
He's the leading architect in the world today. It's very easy to say. If you say, wow, when you're in a place, you must be something happening.
Well, and the challenge is to get it in 2 dimensions on film.
Oh, God. Hopeless. You better give it up and become an architect.
See how this unfolds and is welcoming?
Yes.
And is carrying you in? That facade is not frontal. And that curve leads right into it.
All right, now let me just shoot that curve. Frank's got his own original and sort of perverse way of doing things. We've been friends for several years. We spent a lot of time together bemoaning the difficulties of trying to find personal expressiveness within disciplines that make stringent commercial demands. Several people approached him with the idea of making a documentary about him. And when he asked me if I'd do it, I thought he was crazy. It's not just that I didn't know anything about making documentaries, I didn't even know anything about architecture. That's why you're perfect, he said.
Pretty funny. It's weird. Well, let's look at it for a while, be irritated by it, and then we'll figure out what to do.
What don't you like?
I don't know yet. It seems a little pompous, a little pretentious. This is the part I don't know how to put in words. It's just...
Yeah, but that's the most important part.
If one of these guys came down, and this guy came down, and this one became part of that, then I would start to like it. No, come down, yeah. Now this guy starts to, that's not a good one. This side, I still don't like this side. Craig, I still don't like it. I know why I don't like it. You know, I'll tell you why I don't like it. This has to get crankier, see?
Crankier?
I know how to do it, but it fucks up the, it would work for the African mask. It's just corrugated. You want to try it? Oh, God. Heaven help us. You need one less corrugation. You gotta get flatter, like Maggie. Like that, flatter. Yeah, like that. 2. Yeah, 2 is great. See how it works?
Yep.
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 That is so stupid looking, it's great.
It's so stupid looking.
Isn't it? It's just... I always liked making things with my hands. I remember, I must have been about 8 years old. My grandmother used to get a sack full of wood cuttings for the wood stove. Every once in a while, she'd open the sack and throw the stuff out on the floor and sit down on the floor with me and start building things. We made cities and freeways. It was so much fun. I remember when I was struggling, what do you want to be when you grow up? Somehow I kept remembering sitting on the floor with the blocks. Intuitively, I thought, maybe I could do something like that.
You remember the first time you met Frank, Ed?
Oh gosh, probably in the early 60s. He was completely aligned with artists, and I found that interesting to be somebody who was always there at art exhibits and parties with artists and all that, and not too many architects mixed with artists.
My colleagues who were doing architecture that were my age and were making fun of what I was doing. So I didn't have much of a support system from them. I had a kind of blank stare. And here were these funny artists that I just loved their work, were treating me like I was part of the team, you know?
You know, the artists weren't wed to the tradition. They could do whatever they want, and they'd respond on a gut level. I don't think they're heavy intellectuals, you know, but I'm not saying that they're, you know, that they're stupid, but, you know, they didn't come out of a school. So they did what felt right, what looked right. They manipulate things and really push the limits without the feeling of tradition and history. And I think Frank got the feeling about architecture that, you know, hey, you get an idea, why don't you try it?
Berta found the house. It was comfy and it had a little garden and we could afford it. When I bought it, I realized I had to do something to it before we moved in. I loved the idea of leaving the house intact and not messing with it. I came up with the idea of building the new house around it.
The idea was that they would find this little bungalow and then that would give Frank a kind of laboratory to work in.
We were told there were ghosts in the house. I decided the ghosts were ghosts of Cubism. The windows, I wanted to make them look like they were crawling out of this thing. At night, Because this glass is tipped, it mirrors the light in. So when you're sitting at the table, you see all these cars going by. You see the moon in the wrong place. I mean, the moon is over there, but it reflects here, and you look at it up there, and you think it's up there, and you don't know where the hell you are.
You know, Frank seems to live in the moment. You know, I'd like to think that I do, but I think Frank really does creatively live in the moment. He takes an idea that someone says and finds out what they're about and what they think they want, and then suddenly he's creating it. And the kind of materials that he chooses to use, most of the things are things that are used, I like to think of them as used as building factories or building something that we don't think of as a house.
Let me tell you how he finished his house. One day he went up to shave in the bathroom, and there was no light to shave by. And so he picked up a hammer and knocked a hole in the ceiling into the California sun, and then he shaved by it.
At the same time as I did this house, I was building Santa Monica Place. The night Santa Monica Place opened, we had a dinner here with the president of the Rouse Company. He was a lawyer, and he says to me, "What the hell is this?" I said, "Well, I was experimenting and playing with it." And he said, "Do you like it?" He said, "You must like it." I said, "I do." He said, "Well, if you like this, you can't possibly like that." And he pointed over there towards Santa Monica Place. And I said, "You're right, I don't." And he says, "So why'd you do that?" I said, "Because I had to make a living." And he said, "Stop it." He says, "You should stop it. Don't do that." And I said, "You're right." Now, at that moment, 45 people in my office were working on projects for him. And he and I shook hands that night and decided to quit everything. It was like jumping off a cliff. It was an amazing feeling, and I was so happy from then on. I mean, even with all the stress of it, it just made me very happy.
Your decision to say no, how did you go about that? How did you assume you would generate projects?
You get work through other architects and other designers, mostly from people I'd worked with before that liked my work, liked me, and would bring me into projects. It was touch and go. You remember I was always going bankrupt. I know you were going to say that.
No, I just...
I still feel it, even though it's not true.
Yeah, I know. Well, I can remember that I always thought I was pretending to be a director, that, then,
Really?
Well, then at some point, it just went away. The feeling of pretending went away, and I felt, okay, I'm a director, I guess I'm a director now,
People started coming around and saying things like that I was talented, that I could do this and that. They thought I was, something was going on. When I was a kid, my father used to draw with me. That was something I just loved doing.
What did you draw?
The only thing I remember, I was about 13, I drew a picture of Theodore Herzl when I was in Hebrew school. And I remember the rabbi pinning it up on the board. telling my mother in Yiddish that I had goldene Hand. I had golden hands. I really remember that. Also, we used to go to a summer place in Northern Ontario, and my mother had this lady analyze handwriting. The lady read my handwriting and said that someday I was going to be a famous architect.
You know, I don't think you and I have ever talked about how the architecture started.
I took a class in perspective with Mr. Workman, and I failed. I got an F. I couldn't stand it, so I went back and took it again and got an A. Then I took a class at USC in ceramics. The ceramic teacher said, I have a hunch you should take an architecture class. I'm going to enroll you at night. Every Monday night there's an architecture class. I got an A in the class, and they recommended that I go into second year architecture. And then in the middle of second year, my teacher called me in and said, Frank, this isn't for you. You should get out of here. When he said it, it didn't mean shit to me.
Wait a minute now, come on. You mean this guy says to you, this is not for you, and it didn't devastate you?
It devastated me, but I didn't give up. And that was just before the name change, so. And it was, you know, you could rationalize it as anti-Semitism.
When did you change the name?
Oh, 1954, I think.
What made you change it?
My wife, my ex-wife. When she wanted something, she just got it, right? And so I was pussy whipped more than... And it was hard. And so I told everybody. For 5 years, I would be introduced as Frank Gehry, and I would say, my name was Goldberg. We're going to bring the walls in tighter and make them porous. So that means these can't be solid glass.
Yeah, see, we can move this. So that's the fan just for the office floor.
We work back and forth between the planning and the models. So you make a bunch of plans, and then you try it on the model, and then you get forms, and you start to look at it, and you see opportunities, and then you got to come back and regroup and make all this work. So it's a give and take, because if this doesn't work, that doesn't work. This is the Museum of Tolerance building in Jerusalem. That's the restaurant overlooking the park. This is the bookstore. And you walk...
What's the material on that?
I don't know yet. We're just fussing. Probably be metal. This is the Grand Hall. You can imagine the kind of character of the light coming through the top and through these cracks, and wow, it's going to be really a grand hall.
This is a smaller version.
You know, I always work on 2 or 3 scales at once. Keeps me real.
By changing scale, why does that keep you real?
Because in my head, it keeps me thinking of the real building. I don't get enamored with the object, these things.
I see, and you could...
Yeah, you could. You get excited. It could become jewelry, you know, it could become... This could become the object of desire, which I don't want it to be. We started with this. A stair-step glass thing that we thought. And then we started to do these kind of more free spaces.
And there's where the transition happened.
And then this, and
or here.
I knew this wasn't gonna, this would be enormously expensive and looks chaotic and would be really hard to organize that. Now, here it is here.
Wow.
Everything begins with the models. The problem is the world runs on paper. So we've had to devise ways of automating drawings so that we can continue to feed building departments and inspectors and agencies and contracts and the legal system that are all aligned against doing it this way. What we have done is elaborate on a number of ways of scanning or digitizing those models to bring them into the computers so that we can go directly from the three-dimensional physical model to two-dimensional drawings. What it did was embolden Frank to go farther. He could actually be more sculptural with more confidence and with a great deal of accuracy. I think what was critical to us was to bring the technology in to Frank's process in a way that absolutely didn't change him or his process.
In the old days, when you try to document the building in 2-dimension with a plan, with a section, with an elevation, your understanding and your way to be able to describe the building is very limited, and the contractor and the people who are building it have to sort of put it together. There's an element of interpretation there. Whereas with this particular process, the level of precision allows the designer more flexibility and freedom to explore the shapes and the forms and the geometry of the building.
This model that you see here would get sent to the contractor, and then they would take that information, extract it into a computer file, and send that directly to the manufacturer, who would then build the part. So theoretically, there's no need for paper unless they want it as a verification.
Frank still doesn't know how to use a computer, I mean, except to throw it at somebody, but you know, he got the fact that this was a kind of like an amazing tool that was entirely suited to his ability to pick up this cup, crumple it up, stick it on top of this building and say, that's an interesting shape. Let's see if we can take that shape into some sort of design.
I love the shaping I could do when I'm sketching, and it never, when I was doing, never occurred to me that I would do it in a building. The first thing I built of anything like that is the Vitra in Germany.
I was in a band and we were touring Europe, and I was into the 5th week of the tour and was in that sort of twilight state. It occupies most of your days when on tour, and my head was banging against the condensated window on mid-December afternoon. And I was just looking out at the fields of Germany, and you know, across a plain green field, suddenly this alarming structure reared up, and it jolted me out of this state. We got to Freiburg, and I asked, what was it I'd just seen back there 10 miles? And they said, oh, that must be Vitra.
I started playing with the spiral stair. I loved the way that curve read against the rectilinear. I tried to draw it with descriptive geometry. But when the guy built it, there's a kink in it. It didn't work. The drawing didn't represent what really happened in the site. It was when I got frustrated and asked the guys in the office, isn't there a better way to describe these things? Because I'd like to play with curved shapes. If I could just describe them. That's what led us to the computer.
To my knowledge, it's the first building where that new freedom and the new movement came. The snake, for instance, that staircase is a snake. And that was something very new for me to see that, because I come from Switzerland, a very static country, a very static architecture. And I think that the attraction was that there was something strange, a bit messy. But in the end, these forces unleashed found a new order.
Architects have a lot to answer for, in as much as that it's shite 99% of the time and, you know, depresses people on their way to work and that. And largely I adhere to an English writer's dictum, Oberyn Woe is his name, the son of Evelyn Woe, who suggested that should you meet an architect at a party, the best thing one could do is hit them. And I generally go along with this until I sort of encountered Frank's work.
I grew up in Canada. I used to go to lectures Friday night at the University of Toronto. I went to a lecture when I was 16. It was actually November the 14th, 15, 16, something like that. 1946. The reason I know that is I went back afterward to find out who the guy was that gave the lecture, because at that point I didn't know from architecture. There's a white-haired man got up and spoke about stuff he was doing that really appealed to me. It was very, I'd never seen buildings like that. I didn't go home and decide I wanted to be an architect. That was just in my memory banks. After I became an architect, I realized that must have been Alvar Aalto. I would say my work is probably closer to him than any of the other previous generations.
How many years have you been seeing Frank?
35 years. I met him as a patient. Ed Moses, the painter, sent him over.
Milton took me in and agreed that I could, after the second thing, he said, "You're in limbo with your wife." He said, "I'll treat you if you make up your mind. For 3 or 4 months, you either commit to stay home and make it work, or you leave right now." So I left his place, and I left. I went, got my clothes, and moved to the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. I had 2 daughters and a wife.
He lacked a lot of confidence. He was talking often about being bankrupt, and he meant more than just monetary bankruptcy. He meant bankrupt in his relationships, bankrupt in his ability to get his clients to accept what he was doing.
He was always being Frankie Toronto. He was always fighting as a Jew. He was fighting the Catholics, and he had to show them he was a toughie.
I was angry, but I wouldn't express it, you know. So Milton got me into that group with 14 other characters. And for 2 years, I went to the group and never said a word. One day, they all pounced on me. They said, "You've been sitting here for 2 years, judgmental as hell," you know, and they uncorked me, and I realized that they were right. It was because all of them were saying it. I couldn't dismiss it.
He looked up to me as some kind of mature adult figure, whether true or not. That's how he saw it. And when he realized that our roles were changing, that he, in a sense, was becoming the teacher, because I didn't know very much about art or architecture, I think it helped him to take on the role of the adult in the relationship. And also, instead of trying to seduce his clients, I think he took on more adult roles in relation to his clients. He began to teach them, as he was trying to teach me, to tell them what they needed to see, how they needed to see it. I think in that sense, my naivete was probably a very valuable asset in the therapy.
We go through life, early life, preoccupied about ourselves. The world revolves around our butts and stuff. And as you mature, you expand into the rest of the world and you become part of a world culture, and you sort of find out the hard way even that the world doesn't revolve around your butt, and that unless you play team.
A lot of people think that I made Frank a great architect, which is total nonsense. I didn't make him famous, he made me famous, just the other way around. Matter of fact, after some of the publicity about Frank came out, a number of architects wanted to come in treatment with me. I always said no. I said no because I knew damn well I could not make them Frank Gehry's. I could open up the floodgates, but if there's no flood back there.
This guy that I studied with, this great teacher that I had, used to say that talent was liquefied trouble, he used to say. That was his phrase. You know, there are certain people where the trouble doesn't seep out into another part of the brain where it can be transformed into something else. But that almost all talent was some form of liquefied trouble. All of it is frustration with something as it exists that you're trying to improve on.
You won't remember this, but years ago, when we first met, you talked to me about filmmaking. I was struggling with the world I was confronted with, which is a commercial world. They weren't interested in what I was doing. I talked to you about it one night, and you said that you faced the same commercial world and that you made peace with it by finding this small percentage of space in that commercial world where you could make a difference. Man, that was amazing to me, Sidney. I've never forgotten that. And if you hear in my talks after that, I always talk about it that way. I say, there's a sliver of space. I almost use your words.
Basically, and still more important to me than architecture, is Frank's interest in hockey. My sons are hockey players. I spent hours at hockey rinks from midnight to 6 in the morning. There were not that many around LA, and I would bump into this guy who was not 22 years old. I just struck up this relationship with this person who did chain link and boxes. As we were getting into architecture and I was looking for the next generation of American architects, he was on the list of architects who were kind of pushing the envelope. We bought a hockey team. We needed a practice rink. He designed for us the hockey rink in downtown Anaheim. It is a piece of sculpture sitting in this town. And I think that and Bilbao and a couple other things, his best work. The inside is reminiscent of those hockey rinks that Frank grew up in Canada. All wood, all trusses, looks very traditional, looks like you could be nostalgic for being in Toronto in 1940-something. It is the double rink. The outside is two, like, well, I don't know, breasts? I don't know, but they're like this, so it's a strange woman. You give Frank the functionality. You make sure in the hockey rink you have the workout room and the locker rooms and all that stuff, and you're on Frank that way, and then he delivers the picture.
Do you ever think of architectural shapes unrelated to a job?
No. Well,
I mean, if I'm sitting around the house and I'll put some music on or something, and the music will have it'll suggest some sort of movement or something, and I'll start thinking of shots. I'm just wondering if there's any...
Yeah, there is. When I saw that painting, this one, so this is in the Sainsbury wing, British Museum. It's a Hieronymus Bosch. If you look at it, this is a composition, and I start thinking of them as a composition of buildings. This is the floor plan of the Israeli project, and creating a composition.
That's
Now,
exactly...
It's not literal, but I just find those kind of inspirations, and you file them away somehow. You don't even know you're doing it, and then it comes out, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about, where where it's disconnected from a specific
Right.
job.
Once I saw this that way, I mean, I'd actually seen this painting before and never connected with it like I did that day. And I got to the painting and it dropped me, you know, like I felt the ground cut out from under my legs. It was so powerful. And I saw it as architecture. I think that's what gives me confidence to do stuff when I see it. Once you get it embedded, you do it because you're confident that it's going to work. And I think what some of my colleagues do, they think of architecture in a hermetic way. It's X, and it's not X plus, it's not X minus, it's X. It's got restrictions, it's got rules. If you do this with it, it ain't architecture anymore. Everything has been done before in some way or another. The only thing that changes is technology. What bugs me are these goddamn rules that my profession has as to what fits and what doesn't. There is a certain threatening aspect to taking the leap. But once you try that, once you say, okay, I have a right, you can't stop.
I understand what you mean, that everything has been done before, but I've never seen a building like Bilbao. It's gotten more sensual and musical. Where did all that come from?
I think it just evolved. I was looking for a way to express feeling in three-dimensional objects. You know, if you go back in history, if you go into Chartres Cathedral, it drops you to your knees.
He just let go. He began to develop all of the ideas that he'd been beginning to work with and went the whole way there. I don't think there's a building that comes anywhere near it in inventiveness in this period of our history.
I swear, I don't know why. It moved me just as much at the end of 2 days as it did when I first walked in.
Well, he sees that the whole reason for being an artist is that moment in somebody's eye when you've reached them.
That's it.
The most impressive cathedral at the end of the 20th century is, to me, without question, the museum in Bilbao. You see it and you gasp with astonishment. It's like a vision of a kind of paradise. I don't really know him, you know, I'm not an intimate of his at all.
It has reminiscences of things. You walk down into the entrance and you feel like you're in Luxor. It has the scale of Egypt.
What's important is to be satisfied with what you and the light. See, that's the one thing Frank understands, is light. See, it's the shape of light as it hits another shape. Oh boy, oh boy. And then as you put it, it's peripheral. Architecture is nothing but peripheral.
When Bilbao came up, we moved on a lightning track. The Guggenheim would select 3 architects, Frank Gehry, Arad Isazaki, and Coop Himmelblau. Each firm would be given $10,000, 1 site visit, and 3 weeks to come up with a concept. I remember we rented a suite of rooms in the Frankfurter Hof, I think, in Frankfurt. We flew up there on the 17th of July, assembled all the models, spent a day in deliberations, and when we emerged, Frank was selected as the architect.
I think, I don't know who said this, I think it was a British journalist, but I think he said that this looked like if it was an object from outer space, but which had landed here a century ago. So it's foreign in the sense that it has nothing to do with any of the buildings which are around, but at the same time, there is a quality of it which makes it belong to its place. I mean, you take this out from here, and nobody would understand this city now.
We had 350,000 inhabitants in the downtown,
The first year, we received 700,000 visitors. And then a kind of a community self-esteem has increased so much. We have moved from admiring the architect to be proud of being the clever ones who did this project and have chosen this architect. And we have this building which the whole world admires.
When I see a building like the building that Frank made, I want to stick my stuff in there. It makes me feel encouraged. It makes me feel like, hey, there's somebody that's like setting up an arena where something incredible could occur. He threw down the glove. Let's put something in here that can really take somebody into that transcendental state that you feel when you're making art.
We need some sort of naysayer in this whole discussion. And if that's me, that's fine. But I am ambivalent about his work. He has used the expanded field of art, the expanded field of sculpture, as sculpture and art in general became bigger, broader. It moved out into wider and wilder sites. When it came time to make a museum, Gehry used that expanded scale as an opportunity to trumpet, in effect, with a building that really functions as a spectacle. So I'm not sure how well it serves art.
Either you believe in the white cube, or you are Frank and you say artists want to be challenged. I think museum people are very torn. The great thing about Bilbao is that it does both things. What Frank calls the stodgy galleries, they're very, very simple, sort of old-fashioned rooms. And then he did a lot of spaces that are really extraordinary.
For me, I like to have enough room. But I feel very comfortable in his spaces. He understands scale. And if it does compete with the art, maybe that art isn't good enough.
Everyone seemed to embrace this building and this architect as the great new form, the great new form giver of our time. And I just don't see it. There are moments where I think he has delivered the goods too quickly. He's given his clients too much what they want, kind of a sublime space that overwhelms the viewer and a spectacular image that can circulate through the media and around the world as brand.
People had this idea, what is the architect's service? What's the ideal of service? The service was to be appropriate, okay? That was the big word, and it still is the big word, which means blend in, nobody notices, camouflage, put up a 70-story a new 70-story office building, but make it look like a little Art Deco thing right next door. So who gets anything out of that? You have to not only talk about the freedom, but you also have to talk about the courage of an architect who had the conviction to say, well, that's not what architecture should be doing, and that's not what cities should be doing.
I never expected Bilbao to be the kind of hit it turned out to be. In fact, when it opened, I was very self-conscious about it. And thought, my God, what have I done?
Somebody asked me once about Frank's ego, and I said, well, you shouldn't be put off by the kind of Columbo-like exterior, the crumpled raincoat and the sort of shuffling, kind of like self-effacing manner. I said, Frank's got the biggest ego in the business. And the reason that I know this is that he also has a perception of the process that instead of reacting negatively to a criticism, he'll basically say the reverse of what you might expect somebody with a big ego to say. Let's just rip it apart and start again. Because he knows that when he does it a second time, he does it from a higher plane of knowledge. It's a second opportunity to do that. Now that's real ego.
I act like nothing's happening, you know. I'm aw shucks, booby. Whereas inside I've got I'm ambitious, I'm eager, I'm competitive as hell. But I cover it up. My personality's been to cover it up.
There is nobody that strives for excellence that isn't competitive somewhat. I don't think it's possible. I mean,
but even if, you and I are in a different business, I probably compete with you. I have this conflict about that, I want to be aw shucks, I want to be a nice guy, I don't want to be in your face. And yet I am in your face, and I am ambitious. I think that's the same with the work. I feel like it shouldn't, when I got to Bilbao and saw it for the first time, I got embarrassed. I thought, oh my God, how did they let me do this,
Well, you also have to consider his wife, Berta. I mean, she's part of the whole equation, too, because, he had this anger, if you want to call it, on one hand, and getting out there and doing those things, and then his family life was stabilized, and that's probably kept him afloat.
At first, they had all kinds of rough edge conflict. For example, Berta wanted to be married. Frank had been married and he didn't care about being married. Then he says, okay, I'll get married. He became this much softer, much more accepting, much more loving person, less defiant, less uncertain, less angry.
He seemed so calm and together and sweet, and yet his architecture shows something completely opposite.
There are sort of rules about architectural expression, and they have to fit into a certain channel. Screw that. Doesn't mean anything. I'm gonna do what I do the best. If it's no good, the marketplace will deny it.
I think as he became more confident in his relationships, I think that he became more daring in the willingness to fantasize far out stuff.
I'm watching everything, Well, I can get excited about some fashion thing or some crystal chandelier.
I'm tempted to say it's Frank's right brain. There's something in there, in that right brain, that allows him to take those free associations and then make them practical realities.
If you asked me to simply describe Frank's work, I'd call him a contemporary cubist sculptor. Frank uses shapes and forms unlike anyone has ever used them in the building of a structure.
Years ago, a reporter asked me how I get my inspiration. Just intuitively, I pointed to the wastebasket beside me. And I said, look in there, you see. Think about the caverns and the spaces and the textures in that wastebasket. You can look anywhere and find inspiration. It was by accident that I got into the fish image. My colleagues were starting to replay Greek temples, in the postmodern thing. I don't know, when was that, the 80s? And that was hot. Everybody was redoing the past. He said, Greek temples are anthropomorphic, and 3 million years before man was fish. If you got to go back, if that's where you got to go, if you're insecure about going forward, and you got to go back, damn it, go back 300 million years. Why are you stopping at the Greeks? So I started drawing fish in my sketchbook. I just kept drawing this fish, and then I started to realize that there was something in it.
You know that story of his famous Formica furniture. Frank looked at this material, which is the most pristine material in the world, and it's so uptight that he said to himself, it's not me, you know, I can't do this.
And he just was rattling around and broke it up into little pieces.
He took it and he threw it on the floor in fury.
And some of the pieces suddenly looked to him like fish scales.
He immediately thought, aha.
A good friend of mine was designing this building. He said, why don't you put a little sculpture on the corner and make it a fish? This hotel is a Ritz-Carlton, and the guy that owns Ritz-Carlton at the time was in Tennessee, in Nashville. He couldn't come to the meeting when we made the presentation, so he sent his guy, and he kept getting down, crouching down, and taking this picture. A few days later, the client called me up and said, we got problems. I'm building a multi-million-dollar hotel, and I ain't gonna have my patrons looking up the asshole of a fish.
Do you recognize big changes in your work over the last 30 years?
Well, my starting days as an architect, I was involved with less expensive buildings. I couldn't afford to pay for that beautiful detail.
In the early 60s, Venice was a place of cheap rents. The artists would come in. Larry Bell was one that was close to Frank at that time, and Larry began putting up these walls, interior walls in his studio, and leaving them bare, and where all the scars show, and showing the scars became a kind of thing there that a lot of artists were doing out of practicality, and then finally out of a kind of style thing that Frank also began waking up to.
I grew up a modernist. Decoration is a sin. That's the mantra of modernism. So if you can't use decoration, then how do you humanize a building? How do you humanize a thing? Materials could be expressive.
He was really making a statement that architecture was very much about the materials as well as about the design and the look of it.
It was all to do with making the most out of little bits of throwaway things such as industrial material, picket fence, corrugated metal, and chain link.
Jasper Johns was doing it. Rauschenberg was doing it. They would make beauty with junk.
When he was doing that chain link stuff, he went to Mickey Rudin's house. And Rudin said to Frank, what are you doing with that ugly chain link? How stupid that is. I mean, you just destroy the looks of the world. You make the whole world uncomfortable with that damn chain link of yours. Frank said, Mickey, come on over to the window, will you? What do you see out there?
Let's accrue value here. We're going to do this.
Yeah.
We're going to open this. We're going to do this. We're going to do this.
Yeah.
You know what's confusing to me is what you see from here.
Perhaps what you do here, there's still kind of a gray situation.
It's like a bridge.
A little.
Well, if you do that, you know, you could almost do that and walk under it to the lakefront. That would be the ideal.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, if we do this, it takes it out of the realm that I was worried about.
Oh, I wasn't worried about that. I don't.
I know you don't worry about
I
the same things I worry about.
I'm more naive.
Edwin is more contentious with me than Craig is. Have you noticed? Yes. For me, that's great because it just makes it all much more interesting. He's been with me 15 years. For the first 5 years he was here, he didn't talk. I couldn't get a word out of him. He just sat and watched. And then now, 15 years later, I can't stop him from talking. I don't think I could do the buildings alone anymore. I've gotten so used to the team to play with.
He surrounds himself with good people. What he likes to do is he gets the vague idea, kind of very loosely. Well, you know, something kind of like, something kind of like this, but kind of like, what I'm thinking is something more kind of like that. You know what I mean? So this kind of thing is what I got in mind. You know what I mean? And the guys are standing around, yeah, I think I got it, Frank. And they run off and they do some stuff and they come back and he goes, no, not quite like that. I thought it's a little bit more like this. You know what I'm, like, gosh, you guys have just, I want you to really kind of, more like that, you know what I mean?
No, but if you see the stair like you see here, where it ends.
Where it's sticking out.
Yeah, do that.
The communication is almost nonverbal. We've worked enough together that he can say like 2 words and I'll understand what he wants. Or a quick sketch or reference to a painting or a piece of sculpture and say, try this.
The only thing I'm worried about is these guys wanted something a lot more exuberant.
They do.
Well, I'd rather go to that middle color titanium. That would be beautiful. See that red titanium?
But you sure it's not going to be too red?
The other day, we're doing our offices. He sent me a fax where I was, and he said, would you mind if we flipped the plan? So that's typical Edwin. I would do that myself if he wasn't there, but he's there. I think of it as an opportunistic thing. Maybe one of the kids in the office, just the way he put the model together that day, made me see something. They see they're part of it. So it engenders a great sense of teamwork, which gets you to the end. Craig and I will go home tonight, separately, and we'll agonize about this. And we'll come in tomorrow.
We'll have a dream tomorrow night.
And we'll say, and we usually come to the same conclusion when it's wrong, right? And what makes it wrong? What's wrong is if it's too easy, or if we think we're falling into some kind of cliche.
Or we already did it.
Or we already did it.
That's different. That's different than too easy, right?
Too easy is that
too easy?
I guess I got to suffer a little before.
But that's neurotic. How do you tell the difference between an aesthetic discipline and neurosis?
If you've ever been a client of Frank's, it's a frustrating situation, because you hire Frank because you just love him and you want him to do whatever he wants to do. And people are real encouraging, be far out. But he starts getting far out and they all fall in love. Oh, I love that. Yeah, but he doesn't. He wants to change it until it becomes a frustration game where, God, Frank, when are you going to finish this thing? It looked good 40 times and you're still going.
What's exciting to me is the process. And when people look at this stuff because it looks like it just happened, they don't realize how much time and effort went into the incubation. Yeah. So I'm always compelled to explain all that.
Have you ever had a situation where you've accepted a job and then had absolutely no idea
what to do with it?
Or do you get the impulse first and that's what makes you go after the job?
No, I don't go after the job anyway. I wait till the job's hit me on the head. I guess I don't like rejection, so I just wait until they come to me, because when you go after it and you get rejected, I hate that. And I accept the projects based on whether I like them, the people.
Frank has figured out, which some architects don't quite figure out, is that the most important influence on the design is the client. And if there's a terrific client to work with, you get a terrific building. If there isn't, you don't.
I started talking about water, and Frank and I started talking about water, because he likes boats and I like boats. I said to him that my real dream here would be one day that I was building a new boat, and that one day I'd sail up the Hudson on my new boat, and as I got, you know, past the Verrazano and I'm past Battery Park and coming up the Hudson, there, somewhere on, like next to the water, would be this building. And the next thing, Frank did his little swiggles, and it's essentially that. And what it was that he created was sailcloth. I mean, the idea of making a white building is, you know, when you think about it, a little insane. How do you make a white building that from the inside, actually, you can look out? So then began this odyssey, which was, how do you get glass? And also, it was, let's do the whole thing in glass, nothing else but reed glass. No steel, no shiny things, no aluminum, no parapets, just glass. Frank, any problem that comes up, he finds some solution to. There's something that you never figured out that he goes away and comes back and solves it.
What's the process like? Did he ask you questions? Did you guys just free associate together? Did you just talk?
I don't, it's not like, you know, would you like square or round windows? Or would you like, you know, flocked wallpaper? I mean, no, it's not a query. He doesn't really ask you. He smells, you know, you talk. I mean, he sucks up whatever is going on in the room. With Frank, the work of models, constantly screwing around with ripping something out, you know, or just molding it almost. It's like clay work. Exactly. Is such a profoundly creative process. I mean, it's not like any building project I've ever understood. Literally, if you go back and you take the little squiggle, the whatever it's referred to in the pro jargon, whatever that is, that's that.
I think I have a talent not for recognizing artistic genius, but for recognizing talent. I love what he was doing. And I kept getting, from the day we started, I kept getting richer and busier, and he kept becoming more and more well-known. And then as the adventure of the design of the house proceeded, it was wonderful. I mean, it was so exciting, and I'd go out there, and he was able to do research on material and design things that he never would have had the money to do. And I said, look, you just give me bills for whatever you do, just keep sending me bills. And if I have a problem, I'll talk to you. And I never had a problem. They turned out to be $6 million. And if I had to do over again, I'd do it again.
Well, what happened? Why didn't it get built?
Well, we went on for about 12 years. And I think what happened between 50 and 60, I no longer wanted to live in a big house. I no longer wanted to give big parties. My lifestyle changed. What started out to be a dream would have been, I was building a museum. When we sat down for that last meeting and the number was $82 million,
Jesus.
That was it.
The trouble with having the glass here is that the top of it goes up into this gable, which is really awkward. And either you come up and you shelf over, whereas if you come here, you can go straight up.
I'd like to see that, because I liked this awkwardness here before. This is a building we did pro bono for the memory of a friend of ours. That was the original design for Maggie's place up there, that little model. I had these nightmares that Maggie was talking to me and that was too much architecture and she wanted me to tone it down. And I threw out the thing and started over again.
Having worked with Maggie, he understood the idea of the center, which is to be an informal space for cancer patients. He took on this commission at his own cost because he was a great friend of Maggie's, you know. We're not paying him a penny. And out of love for Maggie, I think he really is committed to a notion of an architecture that relates to healing. Informality, non-institutionality, and a certain amount of humor and places for reflection are very important. It's a very nice place to get up and look out over the landscape. That's terribly important for cancer sufferers, to see their illness in a context which is bigger than themselves.
Why'd you come to Los Angeles?
My father got sick, and it was those days when they said, go to the southern climate. He was broke. He lost everything. He was.
What kind of work did he try to do?
He became a truck driver for Yankee Doodle Pop Company. And I got a job truck driving in the valley for a cousin. This is where we lived, in here. We just didn't have anything. It was really rough.
You got a job as a truck driver. How long did you do that?
2 or 3 years. I met some interesting, I delivered a breakfast nook to Roy Rogers and Dale's house. And they, I came from Canada. I didn't know from movie stars, right? I couldn't believe it. And they treated me like family. They invited me to Christmas dinner.
How do you get out of driving a truck to something else?
What I was interested in as a kid then, my cousin used to take me up flying, and I loved it. I'd get out there and just early morning Saturday and stay till Sunday night and watch planes. And so I got a job washing airplanes.
Where did this come in terms of
before architecture? So I was freaked out in love with flying, so I could have gone that way. If somebody had just given me a job and really seriously taught me how to fly, I probably would have been happy.
It's funny how it feels almost fragile, the way people discover things that are so meaningful for their whole lives.
Right.
I feel the same way.
If I have a big envy in my life, it's about painters. I wish I was a painter. What I'm fascinated with is the moment of truth. There's the canvas. It's on your easel. You got a brush and you got this goddamn palette of colors. And what do? What's that first move? I love that dangerous place.
Have you ever tried to paint?
Never. I wouldn't dare. Because I wouldn't know what to do. I know how to do a building. Since a building ultimately is a surface, it's ultimately got something to do with painting. But I've never been able to achieve what in my mind is a painterly surface.
Oh, yeah?
You look at the Charioteer, that sculpture in Delphi. It's a Roman sculpture. And it says artist unknown. And it's one of the most beautiful pieces of sculpture. And you think about that. When I saw it, I started crying, Sidney, because how powerful that is, that the guy doesn't have his name, you know, that it grew out of a moment in time when there was a consensus and that happened. That's antithetical to democracy, I think. And I'm hoping that out of democracy comes an expression that is, the consensus is democracy. How does that express itself? Express itself chaotically. And that chaos, we're starting to feel is beautiful.
Frank believes in accidents, but I think it's important to say that some of his accidents are failures and some of his work is extremely ugly. People shy away from saying that because they're, in a sense, his reputation is so strong now.
Of the anti-Frank Gehry contingent, is there anybody that hits a spot?
Well, when I see something negative, I usually try it on, like you're trying on a pair of jeans. I try it on for size. I wear it, I think, well, maybe there's something here. I look at it. And then I must get something out of it because, you know, I'm sure but I don't digest it intellectually. I don't take it in as oh, I got to do this or I got to do that. Reporter just did a thing saying that on the Museum of Modern Art, saying that Toronto deserved to get a Museum of Modern Art. Instead they're getting a second-rate Frank Gehry building. Even Marty Filler, who I like, wrote about Chicago and said he thought it was logo texture. So that was his way of saying I'm repeating myself.
How's that affect you when you read that?
I just keep going. I don't pay attention. I mean, what am I going to do?
I think of it as water going down a gutter, and suddenly this wonderful bubble has come up above all the other water, and they can't wait to like pop the bubble and bring it down under the water and push it down to the bottom.
As a critic, I think it's incumbent upon me to make an emphatic stand, to kind of hold a line of disagreement, so that other people are not simply caught up in the kind of culture of affirmation, the culture of embrace that has surrounded Gehry.
This is the only history we're going to be living in, okay? This is the one. We can read about the ones that came before. This is the one that's happening now. Fortunately, there are a few people who understand how to respond to these challenges, and Frank Gehry is one of them. There's only so much that architecture can do, but what he's serving is the so much and trying to realize it.
If you had to criticize Frank, what would you criticize?
I wouldn't criticize him, because I think it's like, you know, flies flying around on the neck of a lion. It's like, you know, watching a movie like Apocalypse Now and saying that you think that Robert Duvall is over the top.
Because buildings take so long to realize, by the time I get to the finished building, I don't like it. I see all the things I would have done, that I should have done, I think. What takes over, what makes you forget all the little trivia, is then the way the light hits the material, the reflections, adds a dimension that you didn't have in the models and drawings. That's how it lives. It becomes a living thing. The only thing an architect can do is be optimistic about how it interacts with the surrounding buildings. It can be a passive player, it can be a stoic player, it can be a passionate player. My thing is, I don't like the Chandler. I mean, it's not great architecture, but it's here and people have a lot of feelings about it. It's part of the community, so you have to respect that, whether you like it or not. I mean, I think that's like being a good neighbor. And so I tried to make a building that would preserve the iconic importance of the Chandler. To defer to that, I decided to break down the scale of the Disney Hall into smaller pieces, so it's not the same language. It relates to the Chandler.
Yeah.
Now, the shapes of the exterior of Disney Hall are based on sailing. When you're wing on wing, the wind behind you, it forms a beautiful space. And if you look at the front of Disney Hall, it's wing on wing. It's the two sails, and you're at the helm. And this is the foyer, and here, when you look up, you'll be able to see the levels.
No matter how great the design is, if it doesn't sound great, it's going to be a failure. Frank was very clear about this from the beginning. He said, this is a hall for the orchestra, and this is a building for music, and that has to be the first priority. And everything else is of lesser importance. And I thought this was quite a statement from an architect. It's very unusual that an artist such as Frank puts the ego bit to a sort of lower level of importance than the actual function of the building.
Let's get the hell out of here, yeah?
Holy shit. Where's the beer? Where's the beer?
Do you ever get depressed when it's finished?
Like postpartum blues?
A little bit.
Yeah, I do. You know that better than I do. You can't let go. When I let go is a year later, after its test of time, didn't leak, people like it, then I sort of let myself out a bit and enjoy it.
Do you ever wonder what part of you did that?
Yes.
Where did that come
from?
from?
Yeah, all the time. I say, well, where'd that come from? Yeah, I do. It's like a magic trick. I call it a magic trick. But you know, when I was a kid taking that ceramics class at SC before I became an architect, Glenn Lukens, you put the glaze on and the stuff, you put it into the kiln, and it would come out looking so beautiful sometimes. And I'd say to Glenn, God, that's beautiful. How did that happen? And he said, just claim credit for it from now on, because somehow you made it happen.
So you haven't seen any of this all together?
When I came last, it was a mess. It looked very precarious, like it might not happen right. You get scared and you wonder, God, what are these people going to think? I want to hide under the covers.
Know the feeling very well.
I know you do. The structural engineer on this is a guy from Stuttgart, George Schleich. He's my age, and I think he's probably the best living structural engineer in the world. You know why this floor is like this? because the offices down below, by code, have to have a certain amount of light. And the only way we could get it and to have this balcony was to make it a glass floor. You know, I'm not going to get to live here and stay here, so I'm only going to see it today and I leave, and maybe I'll see it 3 or 4 more times in my life. For me, it's like one of my children. And I love it.
So what's next, Frank? Is there anything you haven't done that you want to do?
I'm superstitious, so I never say that. When you're a younger architect and starting out, you're seeking some kind of impossible perfection. You could spend your life thinking about this ephemeral building that would be great to do, you know, it would be the capstone of my career. You realize as you mature that there's no there. You ain't gonna get there.
A great many people come to me hoping they can change themselves and settle their anxieties, their problems in their marriage or whatever. They want to know how to handle life better. When an artist comes to me, he wants to know how to change the world.